Too often business owners today are focusing on the little things in business. They're ordering supplies, dealing with employees, and dealing with customers, when what we should be focusing on is the most important thing, cash flow. I've grown over 10 businesses from the ground up. In this podcast, you'll learn the ins and outs of building a business and how to build transferable value. And most importantly, you'll learn how to maximize cash. They call me Cash Flow Mike, and this is the clear path to cash. Hey, it's Cash Flow Mike, and welcome. You're listening to the Clear Path to Cash podcast. And I tell you what, I am with the Cash Flow app queen, right? I'm going to say that, Martha Yasso is my hero and one of my biggest champions too, right? I mean, and I got you finally on a podcast, so I'm super excited about it. So Martha, why don't you kind of give a brief introduction about, who you are?
Well, I'm Martha Yasso. I own Yasso Bookkeeping Solutions. You can find me at www.yassobooks.com. I specialize in small businesses, the small mom and pops. Nothing mid-size. No, I like the small business niche. So that's what I focus on.
Right on. And the reason I have you on today is because you and I have kind of just touched on a discussion that I think, you notice it's a problem. I notice it's a problem. I want other people to notice it too. And what I'm talking about is the definition of cash flow. And more importantly, it's different depending on who you talk to. Now, when I've done small business seminars in the past, I say, hey, if you're an accountant, cash flow is about inflows and outflows. If you're a banker, it means EBITDA, right? It's like a substitute word for cash flow for them when you talk EBITDA. If I'm talking to a small business owner, they just look at their bank statement. Do I have money or not? So, and I've oversimplified it, and I know you're going to reel this in very quickly. But before we begin, I want to mention to people that, hey, if you haven't already, subscribe to our YouTube channel or go to Apple or Google or Spotify. We're on every single directory that's out there, it seems like. So go there. Subscribe, be notified when we've got new episodes coming out like this one, because Martha is going to clue us into what cash flow should be. So Martha, what should it be?
Okay, so I don't know about you, Mike, but when I talk to people, particularly business owners, when you say cash flow, what happens? The glaze over. They've got no clue, and nor should they. So I started thinking about, well, what does cash flow mean? And I come from an MBA background. I have an MBA in banking and finance. So though I thought about cash flow as a financial equation, which doesn't help small business owners at all. Mm-hmm. So I kind of sat down and I said, okay, well, let's just look it up. So I got my old Barron's dictionaries and I looked them up. I looked up in the banking Barron's dictionary, you have one definition that really focuses on banks and how they define it. And then in the investment Barron's dictionary, there's a forecasting definition of cash flow. And then the accounting definition, in the accounting dictionary, it says a definition based on the cash flow statement, which is really cash and looking backwards and reporting what happened, not what's going to happen. So
wait a second. Can I jump in there? Because here's what I heard, bankers are looking forecasting, or investment is looking forecasting. Mm-hmm. Accountants are looking backwards. But mm-hmm. That leaves me, the small business owner, in the middle, in the present. I have to live with, do I have money today, right?
Exactly. And so, of course, the small business owners can be totally confused. But also, they shouldn't have to know what cash flow necessarily means. They need to understand it through the relationship of the bookkeeper accountant who gets to see the numbers every day and has a relationship with the small business owner. And right. That's when it becomes amazing. So for me, I boiled down the definition of cash flow into your revenues coming in, mm-hmm. your expenses going out, your cash balance, mm-hmm. and then what a lot of cash flow people don't mention, time.
Interesting.
Those four pieces have to come together. I see a lot of people just talking about expenses, revenues, and cash balance. No, that's all great, but the business owner needs to know that bank balance definition. On
Mhm.
what day do they have
Right.
the balance that's going to meet their cash needs? So
Yeah.
that's what it comes down to, is just those four little ideas, four little components
Yeah.
of cash flow.
Love it. Well, and I tell you, in the Clear Path to Cash, I have, the fast money formula. And it really incorporates that timing, which is,
Yes.
the speed of cash, as I call it, right? How fast is money moving through the company? It allows you to talk about what I call the financial gap, right? And,
Yes.
and 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 the way I define that is the amount of time where you don't have enough money to run your day-to-day business, right? You're waiting for money to come in as money is still flowing out, right? And there's a gap between your waiting and your paying. So, I mean, can you talk more about, that type of concept? Because the time is something that nobody really factors in. I think you're right.
Yeah, and I think that's the part that small businesses need the most help with, is
Hmm.
that gap and understanding how many days or when that money's actually going to be there.
Hmm.
And you know, for a small business owner, they didn't get into business to know all this stuff. But as a bookkeeper, accountant, it's your job to interpret what that business owner is saying to you. Well,
Hmm.
I have a project coming up. I have this great opportunity, this new contract. Well, there are front end expenses that an accountant is going to know that have to happen. Look at that cash gap. Find out
Hmm.
when that timing is going to be. Because that cash gap, as an accountant and bookkeeper, it might say to you, hey, we need to go talk to a bank to get a line of credit, or maybe we find another way to finance this. But you can make those goals for the small business owner happen. You
Hmm.
just need the information and the path to cash and your days. It's critical to knowing how to plan.
It's funny. I mean, you mentioned days, and some business owners don't understand. They can get it where, oh, I understand how
Mm.
long product sits on the shelf for how long, but they don't realize that it's a measurement of speed. Now, when I was a state trooper, I used to measure speed in miles per hour. But now, I mean, the last 20 years, I've been measuring speed in days. Right?
Yeah.
So,
Oh,
so, so very cool. So let me just kind of break in and say, hey, listen, this is exactly what I live for, right? I mean, cash flow, talking cash flow, understand the dynamics about it. And you'll always hear it right here on the Clear Path to Cash podcast. And you can catch us on any of the big directories: Apple, Google, Spotify, even the YouTube channel. So if you're watching us, if you want to see what we look like instead of just sound like, go to YouTube, watch this episode. So I'm talking with Martha Yasso, and we're talking cash flow. So let's take it a step further, right? So is there a secret that you think of that maybe you can identify struggle, right? Is it a feeling? Is it an analysis? How would you describe to somebody who said, hey, listen, when X happens, you should worry about Y, meaning the next thing.
I'd say it's it is an emotion. I think when a business owner comes to a point where there's a new opportunity, um, many times it's a first time experience. Well, this is the first time I'm getting a major contract,
Hmm.
or this is the first time I have to deal with a pandemic. Um, and the emotion that kind of comes over with that, and the overwhelm, it's it's the responsibility of the bookkeeper or accountant to really kind of process that
Hmm.
with the small business owner, to kind of sit down and break it down into a conversation of, well, you know, this pandemic thing is happening. I'm trying to figure out what's next. Explore that pivot conversation.
Hmm.
But what a lot of these business owners are coming to understand is if they had had a cash flow a type of app in place prior to
Mhm.
a major change, a major first time experience, they could go back easily and say, okay, here's my information.
Right.
Now I have good information to make a decision.
Hmm.
Let's choose based on this information that I have what I do next.
Right.
And
Well, what's interesting about that is that, cash flow problems aren't, they're not just for struggling companies. I mean, a successful company can also have cash flow problems. So I mean, and what you described was you can feel it, right? And what the feeling I describe to people is, have you ever felt like you couldn't pay a bill or you were worried about, filling an order or something like that because it costs money to do those things? So whether you're struggling with not enough cash flow or you're growing so fast that there's not enough cash flow, it happens and the feeling's the same, right?
oh, absolutely. It happens in good decision. It happens in bad decisions. It's that, like you say, it's that uncomfortable
Hmm.
sensation that comes over you. And I think we all have that feeling at some point that we're not sure what the next step is. I think it's it is absolutely the role again of that bookkeeper accountant to say, I'm here by your side. And don't
Hmm.
necessarily say, we're going to talk cash flow. We're going to talk ideas instead.
Right.
And so the accountant bookkeeper having your tool in the path to cash to be able to look at what you call levers of cash flow, that's huge for the bookkeeper accountant to be able to turn around and say, well, if I move this lever just a little bit or that lever and have a conversation to with the small business owner, it takes away that fear feeling because you have
Hmm.
a professional, you have a pro that
Right.
understands this complicated stuff and has broken it down into smaller parts of the business. Maybe I look at price.
Hmm.
Maybe I hold off and pay a bill maybe 2 days later.
Hmm.
But if you can break that down into smaller steps, it makes that scary moment of not knowing whether you're going to write this check. Am I going to be able to cover this check? It makes that uneasy moment less stressful
Yeah.
because
So
you have a tool, you have some understanding.
yeah, yeah, and it goes so far beyond analysis, right? The reporting of the past and the analysis. This is you as the advisor, the consultant, the accountant, the bookkeeper, CPA, the advisor, actually understanding the business of your client, right? Beyond the numbers. It's like
Oh,
you have.
absolutely beyond the numbers.
So and that's what I talk about. You've mentioned, the software that I built called, Path by Simplex, but what we're trying to do there is put the context around the analysis, because if you just look at the number and go, well, that's a 2, that's good or bad, well, that doesn't make sense. Right? But if I say, well, it's a 2 because that means you have $2 in checking account to pay for every dollar you have in a credit card, that helps me make more sense about what you're telling me as a business owner. So uh, you know what's some good ways for an advisor to leverage cash flow in the definition that you have, um, with their clients? I mean, what would be a solid gem that you could give them?
Well, for me, when when you hear the word advisory, I don't think of advisory beyond the first step of advisory.
Hmm.
And particularly with the small businesses, that's cash flow.
Hmm.
KPIs and the other measurements, that's great. But the first step of advisory is understanding the cash flow of that small business
Right.
and and breaking it down, as you say, into context. What does that $2 really mean? And the accountant bookkeeper is that bridge.
Yeah.
You're kind of like the interpreter for all these fancy concepts and ideas, and break it down into what the business owner knows, what they
Mhm.
experience in their daily business experiences. Talk to your business owner in terms by using your information in Path. Talk to your business owner in terms of their business
Right.
and what the next decision is, and not huge goal, but the small steps towards that goal.
Mhm.
And that can be absolutely freeing for small businesses. Recently, since the pandemic, I've been getting a lot of phone calls from small businesses that have said, I reached out to my CPA, and they do my taxes every year, and I talk to them, twice a year, uh, but I don't feel like they're helping me with my business right now. And I'll talk to these businesses and say, well, what's your goal? And then we have a conversation. And that's what's not happening so
Mhm.
many times out there, the conversation.
Yeah. But
Um,
why? And this is the way I do it, right? Like going, hey, if we're going to work together, because I don't look at any engagement with the people that I've worked with as being short term. So if we're going to work together for the next year, 5 years, 10 years, doesn't matter. I mean, just even if it's just a relationship from friends, where are we going? What are we trying to do?
yes.
I can't give you advice unless I know what it is you're trying to do. Are you trying to retire on the beach? You want to buy a different company? What's your next goal? And let's work towards that today. So that's really. Hey, speaking of that, I get a lot of people ask me this question, and I want to know if you or how you answer it, right? Which is, how much cash should I have? Right? What's it? I mean, you ever get that? Somebody
Enough.
says, "Well, I don't even know how much that I should have." Do you have a rule of thumb? I mean, I know what I tell people, but do you have something?
I don't necessarily have a rule of thumb. My finance upbringing says that, every industry has a norm for that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Very honestly, I go back to, frankly, your app. I hate to keep doing this, but you know,
Yeah.
your apps, you break it down to simple parts,
Uh,
and to
Thank you.
understand where your expenses hit and when, that is a good indicator to me how much cash needs to be in the bank at
Hmm.
any one point in time. But how much cash? Some businesses get away with a very, very tiny margin
Sure.
of excess
Sure.
cash. Other businesses can run on negative, get a line of credit, and carry that time period. So how much cash? That's, yeah. I don't want to say I don't know, but if
Yeah.
my client had asked me that,
Yeah.
I would have said, give me a minute, let me go back and take a look and figure out what the industry says.
Sure.
And then I'd look at your app.
Well, but if you're listening to the call, I mean, here's how I answer it. And you're right. It's kind of all over the board, no matter who you talk to. I mean, Bill Gates said he used to keep 1 year's worth of salary, right? Not his, everybody's. He said, because if I made a bad decision, I didn't want the employees to feel it. Right. So he would
Right.
keep 1 year's worth of payroll in reserve. Now, I don't think all of us can do that.
No.
but but I tell people all the time, I said, if you're looking for a goal, if you're looking for how much should I have, I tell them 3 to 6 months operating expense. Try to
Yep.
keep it in there, right? At least that
Right.
way, if there's a threat or an opportunity, you've got enough cash to ride it out. COVID hits unexpectedly, you at least got 3 to 6 months to kind of live with no sales to figure it out. Or hurricane, or maybe your competitor next door goes out of business and you're trying to pick up some of his. I mean, it's there's a amount of cash that you can have that kind of gives you some breathing room. And I think it's 3 to 6 months operating expense. I mean, what do you think of that as a rule of thumb?
I like that. I really do. I mean, I've heard that number in several different places, both in personal finance as well as small business uh, bookkeeping and advisory. And I think that's a comfortable place to be, because it's not too much or a, a level that's going to impinge upon investment in a small business. Um, and yet, like you say, it's enough to be a 3-month cushion. So yeah, that.
Yeah, that's all you're trying to do is get a little breathing room in case
Yep.
you got to change, pivot somehow. All right. So, hey, here's the last question I ask of everyone, right? I ask everybody, it's your turn. So, let's imagine your best friend. Your best friend is starting a small business and they've come to you for advice. What do you tell
Get a good bookkeeper.
them? There you go. That's a good one, right?
And it's funny because when these clients recently have called me and they've said, "How come my former accountant didn't do this?" I just answer, "You had the wrong accountant." You got to look. If you're a new business, you've got to look for that relationship where you can turn to your bookkeeper and say, "This is the next step. How do I get it done?"
Yeah.
Or, "I'm here, and what is the next step?" Going through the sales tax setup.
Yeah.
If you can make that easier for a client, that's huge. Oh, and the client values that. So yeah, that's my advice. Get a good bookkeeper.
Good piece of advice. So, hey, Martha, thank you very much. Keep up the good work. You are out there, giving us all the information we need on how to manage our cash flow and finding the right tools to do it. Right. I think,
Absolutely.
I don't know of anybody else in the country that's doing that but you. Is that right? Or you're kind of the
Not
leader.
that I know of right now. I mean, my goal is to make the concept more simple, more clear, and easier to understand. And if you can understand it, well, then it's easier to do.
Yeah.
And to get the experience in you and understand that it's not frightening. It's just one step at a time. But if we can all get the same definition of what that cash flow is, let's start on a common understanding and move forward.
Okay. Well, let's give people your website one more time.
Sure. It's Yasso Bookkeeping Solutions at www. Yasso, Yasso, that's S like Sam, books, BOOKS.com.
All right, yassobooks.com. Good. Hey, I'm Cashflow Mike, and you have been listening to the Clear Path to Cash podcast. Join us every episode, and I was just lucky enough to have Martha Yasso on today. And as always, I'm going to remind you, don't be a dumb business owner.